Hello! You get glitter stitches and I get glitter stitches and our projects get glitter stitches. Today, I'm the Knitting Fairy Godmother and today we have book club. We are talking about this wonderful little book. I call it little because it fits in my hand. It's Mindful Thoughts for Makers, Connecting Head, Heart, and Hands by Ellie Beck. Today we are on page 65 and the chapter title is called Working in the Flow. So makers and being in the flow, it goes back a very long time, this idea that when someone is creative and working on a project, time and space no longer exist. And there are some scientific people who have studied this. So the first person I want to talk about is a psychologist. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi is the person who developed the term flow. He coined the term flow in 1975, and he wrote a book called Flow, The Psychology of Optimal Experience, and Ellie Beck talks about his book. So there's a TED Talk from 2004. You should go Google it because it's really interesting. If this is interesting to you, I think you would enjoy it. So Ellie talks about finding your flow, and Csikszentmihalyi talks about how do we determine if we're in the flow or not. And there's lots of tools that you can use, like questionnaires, conditions. You can think about getting into the flow as sort of an aspirational goal. For me, that's too hard. I have to start smaller. And one tool that I have used and developed to try to get to flow quicker and faster is my getting ready ritual. And I'm looking for my wand. You know my getting ready ritual because when you see the wand and you get glitter stitches and I get glitter stitches and our projects get glitter stitches, we are priming the pump. We're setting up for whatever is going to happen, but you know that I'm going to be on camera talking about knitting. When you see the wand, you know that knitting conversations will ensue and follow the wand, right? So there's the getting ready ritual. And I've heard this described as lots of different things. Some people call it a micro movement, where you take one small action with your body to get ready, and then what follows is trying to get to the creation, the attaining flow, whatever the condition that you're trying to achieve is. That getting ready ritual is just sort of one step. It's getting you to that point quicker, faster. Another thing that comes up for me is that I have to practice, and I can't have the expectation that flow will happen all of the time. But the more that I practice, the quicker and easier it is to get into flow. So sometimes, I knit all the time. Obviously, I knit all the time. And sometimes when I knit, I get to flow, and sometimes when I knit, I do not get to flow. So for me, I just have to knit, and then if the flow comes along, then it's like that's a fun, exciting point, and I'm trying to recreate those conditions every time I knit. And sometimes that's practical and sometimes it isn't, because I use different knitting for different things. So even within the activity of knitting, sometimes I use knitting to get to flow, and other times I know that that's not the purpose. So I think about getting into flow a little bit differently than what Ellie talks about. And It's interesting for me because in this chapter, Ellie talks about getting to flow as one side of the coin, and then the other side of the coin is if you're blocked. And they really are two sides of the same coin, because you can't have a creative experience without having the uncreative experience. And they're linked, those two conditions. So knowing that, to me, helps to alleviate some of the pressure I might feel if I'm not experiencing flow or if I'm not being creative at that moment. Some other things that come up for me are tactics and ways to skirt around the feeling blocked, and a couple tools that I use for that. So one of them goes back to practice, because if I know that every day at the same time, again, it's a ritual that I use. I sit down and do the same thing every day, and that helps me build practice, that helps me build resiliency, that helps me with my getting ready ritual. In the process of doing that every day, obviously, because it's every day, I cannot have the expectation that I'm going to get to flow every day. So showing up and having the curiosity and wonder of what's going to happen today helps me take the pressure off of having a massively creative experience every single time that I sit down to knit. And it's one way that I take pressure off of myself to achieve that every time. Somebody else that talks about being blocked a lot is Julia Cameron, and she talks about how if we're constantly having output, then we have to be having input also, and that there is an equal exchange happening between ideas going out, the creation process, and ideas filling our bucket. So in that way, one tool that I have used is called the artist's date, and it's where you take yourself on an inspiration date. And the more you do it, the easier it becomes. And sometimes our blocks come from the fact that we have output too much and there's not enough coming in. And one way to achieve some input is by having an artist date. And it just sounds like really special and mystical and a little bit like you're playing hooky from work, because who takes themselves out on a date? But it's one way that we can fill our inspiration bucket if we've been creating. And mashups, like this is another idea where maybe I mean, I'm a knitter, right? So going to some place with fiber and yarn and knitting, that's my language, that's my medium of choice. But a mashup artist date where I'm doing something completely opposite, or maybe I'm attending a writer's workshop, maybe I go to a pottery workshop or a pottery studio where I see other mediums at work or at play, or inspired, other artists being inspired by other things that aren't part of my sphere of perception, because I'm in the fiber world, and that's a little bit different than some of the other creative mediums. Even going to academia and having a studious approach where you're studying something, that can be learning inspiration. And all of these new ideas feed your inspiration bucket, and then that helps you to avoid burnout, it helps to get to flow quicker, and it helps your brain to like make these creative associations that only you're the only person in the entire world that can think about these two things in the way that you think about them. So those are some tools that I use to achieve flow, and if I'm not in flow, to unblock and sort of get closer to flow, because even by showing up, I am inviting flow to visit me, and that's the rub. If you're not inviting flow to visit, then how does flow show up? And I'm creating the conditions for all of those wonderful, juicy, inspired ideas to visit me. Yeah. Okay, so that is our big reveal, our big conversation for today, and we'll talk more next week about the next chapter. So I will see you next week. Bye, everyone.